Hello, Mr. McCulloch, and welcome. I have to do, you're the only chap here who hasn't heard this before, but I have to do a health and safety briefing before you enter. We have an emergency, it's when you leave, toilet throughout the day, and we assembled at probably the most inappropriate place, Spates Ale House. So on that basis, we'll commence with your presentation. Thank you. And how do we pronounce your name? Sorry.
McCulloch.
McCulloch.
McCulloch, yeah. Yeah, too many vowels. Lorena, thank you for the opportunity to thank you for the opportunity to present this to you. My name is Gavin John McCulloch. I'm a principal planner employed by Foresight Consulting, which is now part of SLR. I'm attending today on behalf of the fuel companies to assist the panel on matters within my planning expertise. My evidence addresses the following provisions which are the subject of this hearing stream. Policy HAZ CLP 14, HAZ CLP 15, and a proposed new policy HAZ CLP. I understand that the evidence is to be taken as read, and I will not repeat it, but I'll be pleased to answer any questions in relation to it. Hazards and risks, contaminated land. I speak today on the policies that address contaminated land and hazardous substances, and the avoidance direction that's expressed in policies P14 and P15. My core concern regarding the avoidance direction in P15 in relation to new contaminated land is that it may lead to provisions in underlying plans which prohibit or unnecessarily constrain the storage and use of hazardous substances. Secondly, I believe that clause 3 of policy P14, managing contaminated land, may lead to provisions in district and regional plans that require remediation of contaminated land, where this is not justified on the basis of risk to human health or the environment, and where it is not appropriate to manage contamination in situ. Thirdly, I'll speak on a new policy proposed in my evidence in chief to avoid the duplication of existing legislation. Policy P15, new contaminated land. To my mind, contaminated land and hazardous substances are two distinct matters. Contaminated land is defined in the RMA by the presence of hazardous substances on or in the land, and that has or is reasonably likely to have significant adverse effects on the environment. Hazardous substances are defined in the Hazardous Substances and Noxious Organisms Act as substances with intrinsic properties that are hazardous. They are widely used by the community in amounts from small domestic quantities through to industrial production and bulk storage quantities. New contaminated land can only be created by the release, accidental or negligent, of hazardous substances of a nature or quantity that causes significant adverse effects on the environment. I cannot foresee a situation where a council would grant a consent to contaminate land. Rather, I anticipate any such release would be more subject to, or at least consideration of, enforcement action. I also consider a policy direction to avoid new contaminated land is inconsistent with the overarching objective of this chapter, NHCL 03, to manage contaminated land. As detailed in my evidence in chief, I agree with the intent of the fuel company's submission that an outcome of the avoidance direction may be the creation of unnecessarily onerous consenting pathways for the use, storage or disposal of hazardous substances in regional and district plans. I disagree with the section 42A author's argument that a policy avoiding the creation of new contaminated land is necessary to achieve the direction set out in NHCLO3. The intent is better served by a policy that requires appropriate management of hazardous facilities. As the risk associated with the storage and use of hazardous substances is principally addressed by other legislation, as recognised by the amendment to the RMA to remove the explicit function for councils to control hazardous substances, I consider any policy should focus on where adequate controls are not provided for by other legislation. This could be achieved by replacing P15 with the following policy: manage the use and development of hazardous facilities where analysis demonstrates adequate controls are not provided by other legislation. Policy HAZCL P14, managing contaminated land. Policy P14 is proposed by the reporting officer directs management of contaminated land so it does not pose unacceptable risks, including in clause 3 the requirement of avoiding as the first priority and only where avoidance is not practicable, mitigate or remediation of adverse effects. As set out in paragraph 34 of my evidence in chief, section 42A author in addressing the fuel company's submission acknowledges that this policy engages with existing contaminated land and it is beyond the point of avoiding all adverse effects on the environment. My concern is that a requirement to avoid further effects where practicable does not recognise that what may be practicable may not be necessary in terms of risk to human health or the environment. And what may be practical may not be sustainable. I consider the reporting officer's intent and sustainable management would be better achieved by amending P14 as set out in paragraph 38 of my evidence in chief to reduce residual risk. Set out the change to the policy below. Clause 3 would become reducing residual risk to acceptable levels. Hazards and risk, contaminated land, a new policy. In my evidence in chief, I proposed a new policy to direct plan makers to avoid duplication of hazardous substance controls provided by other legislation. I consider this is important to reinforce the clear direction under the Resource Legislation Amendment Act, that in my experience has not been consistently recognised by councils in preparing proposed plans and plan changes. The importance of this is reflected in analysis undertaken by Foresight on behalf of the fuel companies of proposed plans and plan changes addressing hazardous substances following the Resource Legislation Amendment Act. That analysis shows that significant numbers of councils are still proposing, by draft or notified plans, hazardous substance provisions that duplicate other legislation. This necessitates significant inputs by submitters to ensure that hazardous substances controls are adequately justified. In my opinion, the Council has the opportunity here to use the RPS to give effect to the clear direction from central government. By way of example, during my time as Principal Planner for Wanganui District Council, I was responsible for progressing the Wanganui District Plan, Plan Change 54, General Industrial Zone, Contaminated Land and Hazardous Substance chapters. The operative version of that plan includes the following policy at the district level, which I consider to be comparable and helpful. Policy HAZP3, avoid duplication with other statutory processes applying to activities involving hazardous substances, which makes it very clear. To finish, I've just referred to when I was last here, a prior question, and presenting to the panel on 17th of March 2023 in the Energy Infrastructure and Transport hearing. I was asked a question which I consider appropriate to revisit here in relation to contaminated land. That question was, are the fuel companies seeking to limit consideration of adverse effects of existing infrastructure because that would require additional management of discharges from existing contaminated soils. So my answer at the time was no, but the issue around consideration of adverse effects of existing infrastructure was not because of concern of additional management of discharges. Fuel companies' facilities must be managed in accordance with the 3 relevant acts. In terms of existing contamination, fuel companies, in concert with the Ministry for Environment and other parties, developed a number of appropriate and relevant guidelines that apply to various aspects of activities, including guidelines for assessing and managing petroleum hydrocarbon sites in New Zealand. Fuel companies have also sought rules and plans around the country to encourage identification and investigation of contaminated land and require management of risks associated with contaminated land to acceptable levels. These matters had also been specifically addressed in feedback last year to Council to inform its work on the regional plan review. That was what I wish to present. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. McCulloch.
Thank you. Just in relation to P15, you suggest that it's very unlikely that council will consent to contaminated land. I guess the obvious question that arises there as well, what's the problem with the policy? Because you're saying it's never going to happen. But I guess what is the issue here? Is it it's a legacy issue, really, isn't it?
Contaminated land is a legacy issue. Concern is that the policy is written.
I guess is it what? Because I am aware that, for example, here in Dunedin, some of the fuel storage sites down around the port are contaminated, but I guess that's not going to happen in the future, is it? Because of the way we manage things. Or is there a potential for that to still occur, I guess?
Well, there's a complementary set of rules. Management of the hazardous substances is under the HSNO Act. The intent of that is to prevent contamination. There's not a circumstance I can think of where there would be a deliberate application to seek to contaminate land.
Yeah.
Nobody has an intent. Nobody has a willing intent to contaminate land. And fuel companies work particularly hard to avoid that now. And
when I read that policy, my mind jumped straight to the hail legislation and some of the activities under there that are considered historically to be contaminated sites. And there's a number in there that, in discussion with council stuff, you say, for example, market gardens and orchards using prolonged use of pesticides. And I guess that's where it's not practicable to avoid that scenario. And I think permitted activities kick in there and allow the use of those sorts of things within the framework of a permitted activity. But outside of that, I'm with you. I'm trying to think of where
so
potentially there may be contamination, but that leads into that second issue you raise around the residual risk to acceptable levels.
So that's the management of existing contamination.
Which if you're still doing a new activity started now and it was permitted via the regional rules to use sprays in horticulture, technically that site becomes a hail site in future when someone applies for land use. It gets all very confusing. So then P14 would kick in.
So that the use of those hazardous substances should be in accord with the national legislation, which has an intent to avoid contamination.
And that's where your managing the residual risk comes in, because
Well, and the initial action should be to avoid the contamination, so you're managing that risk straight up from your activity. That's separate to managing the contamination that exists.
yeah, I don't think you can in a lot of those circumstances. When I look at what the hail legislation, it's been suggested that it's something different, but it's all connected, unfortunately, when it comes to future land use planning. Straight council staff will go and say, oh yeah, it was an auction, so it's contaminated under maybe not the RMA definition, but straight away you're getting into a hail scenario. Yeah. So was that the sort of type of thing you were thinking about in terms of P14? Do you have an example around that, where there may be an issue that you get, it may be contaminated, but it's not at the level to induce harmful effects to humans in the context of your work, the fuel companies?
In terms of, so that would be a matter to assess site by site and what the background levels are, and that the rest of that policy requires those things. So manage contaminated land, assess and if required, monitor, protect human health in accordance with the regulation.
Thinking in the context of fuel companies' issues reducing would almost be, to do that you'd have to take an awful lot of soil away and lock it up somewhere probably, which is not practical.
You're moving a contaminant from one place to the other potentially.
Yeah, so then you run into the problem of P15 again, because you're automatically going to contaminate that site.
So that's the intent of the changed wording is to manage residual risk. So identify whether it has to be, whether the contaminations of a nature that it has to be actively managed, or whether the contamination is residual and no longer presents an unacceptable risk to human health or the environment. In which case it's is there an additional monitoring required, or is it it's stable and degrading and it can be left?
Yeah.
And I guess that's the reason why the hail site rules operate, in that it may be stable and degrading and it's left. And a new person coming to that site has to understand that that's its history.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's an interesting concept, because I know, for example, some sites that have been landfill sites that have been developed for residential purposes, even though there's various things been undertaken to manage that issue, are still on a hail list. So you still would be caught up in this framework because they're still considered contaminated.
Potentially contaminated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful just to understand, because even though I'm basically not simple, it's actually not that simple to deal with this issue. Thank you.
You're Mr. McCulloch, good to run into you again.
All right.
St. James 54.
Yes.
Yeah. I just have one question in your evidence in chief. Your amendment, the amendment you saw on commercial port activity. It's a silly sort of a question, but in I of that amendment, you say provision and maintenance of the mole at Aramoana. What's a mole?
Oh, the mole is the long rock structure extending out into the sea.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, that's all.
Okay,
That's
okay,
what,
yeah.
you know, I made a note of that when I read it initially. I said, what is a mole?
Yeah, typically if it's in a beach, it's called a groin. If it's out into the sea for a harbour, it's called a mole.
Oh, right. Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. You've proposed for your new P15. You've proposed. I see there's no definition of hazardous facilities in the RMA. I'm assuming there would be and has no, or potentially any hail.
ASNO has major, as a definition of major hazard facilities,
Right.
that may require.
I suppose I'm just sort of looking at your proposed policy there and wondering whether a definition of hazardous facilities would be appropriate to sit alongside that or not. Just wondering if you've got any view on that.
It is probably necessary, yes.
Yeah. Are there any that you're aware of, and any legislation or
I would have to
yeah.
go back and check that. I can bring that information back if you require.
The only other, I just had one question from your evidence in chief. One remaining question, and Ellen's covered a couple of things off, but in paragraph 42, so pretty close to the end there.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could sort of expand and possibly provide an example there. I suppose you're sort of talking around some duplication. I mean, I suppose I was just trying to get a feel for the amount of additional work or the duplication that's going on and what the implications are for the fuel companies there.
Also, there's some work in progress at Foresight, which has looked at 40 district plans so far and plan changes. And within that, many are still making those duplicated rules to a greater or lesser extent. There are a number which have not. Excuse me, spreadsheets are a challenge for my eyesight. So Bay of Plenty, for example, have changed, undertaken plan changes in which, for example, the Operative Opatiki district plan has removed hazardous substances controls entirely in a similar way that Whanganui district plan has.
So no controls whatsoever in their district plans, they're just leaving it up to regional councils and other. There's two ways it's managed. So in the Whanganui district plan, it's managed by the land use controls. There is a definition of major hazard facilities, and the industrial zoning controls their location. The control of hazardous substances is referred entirely to the national legislation. And there are varying degrees in which councils have done that. Thank you. That's all from me.
Just following up the discussion with Bianca Sullivan in relation to your suggested policy 15 at the top of page 3. The use of that phrase hazardous facilities, are the facilities necessarily hazardous themselves? I mean, is it better not to use terminology of facilities for handling or for storage, handling and use of hazardous substances?
Well, that, yes, you could build that wording into the policy. or the alternative would be to have a definition of hazardous facilities that spells that out. But yes, you could you could address the activity rather than the infrastructure in that statement.
Probably looking at P15 and just thinking about issues that have arisen over the past, that I've certainly seen where that policy might be able to be relied upon by council, relates to the issue of accidental discharge. And I remember particularly two port developments in Marlborough, one at Shakespeare Bay and one at Clifford Bay, where particularly Clifford Bay, I think it was, where fuel in particular was likely to be stored in major quantities. The issue became what would happen if there was an earthquake and there was rupture of those containers, and what was a reasonable bund requirement to be able to contain spillage that arose from such an event. And in, the conditions that flowed from that would have carried very substantial capital costs to create that bund. And I would have thought that this sort of policy might have been a good base on which to rest such conditions. Did you turn your mind to that?
It could, again, that takes us to the scale of the facility, which the HSNO Act also very clearly spells out the requirements for storage of hazardous substances. So that also sets the basis for requiring the type of bund that was needed in that instance. Yes, I mean, I agree with you that the wording of this policy would support those conditions. The concern is that there are a whole range of lesser circumstances where you might be beginning to constrain activities which are managed by the HSNO Act.
The other one that occurred to me, different factual scenario, but was the Marpua situation, where you had a situation where the government had to step in the end. As I understand, and I never got into the detail of it, but I'm just basing this on newspaper reading, that the solution, as I understand it, in the end, was to actually physically move that soil treated at another location. And you've made had an interchange with Commissioner Cubitt about that. Again, this policy would be a valuable tool, wouldn't it, for a regional council faced with that type of dilemma, that it gives them the ability through conditions to be pretty tough on the way in which they deal with the site where the remediation is to occur.
Yes, it would. Again, if you were, if it's a situation where contaminated materials are being taken and they'll be remediated somewhere which has no contamination, the alternative proposed, and perhaps the word term hazardous facilities is not quite the right one, but what you're talking about is the remediation site is land that you want to manage in a way to handle those hazardous substances.
Yes.
Specific answer on that. Sorry. I can see both approaches.
Yeah. That's right. Thank you. Just a final point. I'm possibly being picky here, and I don't want to be unfair on you, and I may be wrong. So correct me if I am. But a paragraph, if I compare the wording of paragraph 38 with your wording now, which you presented to us for P14, they do seem to be different. The one you proposed at P48 was avoiding unacceptable risk on the environment. Am I talking about the same thing?
Yes, you are.
So is the position just that you want to change your position?
Yes.
Yeah. That's right. I just found that correctly. Thank you very much, Mr. McCullough. Thank you for making the experience today, because it puts a different emphasis, gives a real flavour to the words.
Okay. Thank you.
Quarter. Are they hearing? Yes. Come forward. Thanks.
Yeah, lucky I was to come at this time because I wasn't intending to. So,
Well, it's good for us and good for you.
Yeah.
You thought, yeah.
I thought I'd be waiting for more. That's on, is it?
I just press the right.
It'd be a read night.
Yeah.
The lid up, ready to go.
Read. So ready to go. Hopefully this is relatively straightforward because I've only got 3 points to talk to. But first introducing myself, my name is Julianne McMahon. I'm a consultant planner. I work for WSP as a senior planner. But in that role, I do a lot of work for Waka Kotahi. And in this instance, I've been asked to be part of the RPS team that you'll see a variety of planners before you of different chapters. So my job is the hazards chapter. Most of Waka Kotahi's submission points were relatively minor for this chapter, and I won't be discussing these today. They're mostly around privileges being asked to be retained as notified. I'll be discussing the 3 points raised in my evidence, which is the definition of hard protection structures, P3, which is the new activities policy, and P6, protecting features and systems that provide hazard mitigation. I'll be discussing my evidence, but I would also like to highlight examples and support. I think it was lacking in that I needed to provide some examples. And the examples I'm going to discuss come from a discussion with Peter Robinson. I think you've heard his evidence prior. He talks about the role of Waka Kotahi and its operational functions of the highway. Other examples, that comes from my own knowledge because I've done a lot of Waka Kotahi work over the years. So anyway, moving on to hard protection definition. Waka Kotahi, this is a really sort of basic kind of maintenance kind of thing that Waka Kotahi does all the time, and it's about riprap. The 42A report writer has rejected the inclusion of the word riprap in the definition. I don't think the submission is unreasonable given the nature and how it can be used in the operation and maintenance of highways. The use of riprap as hard protection will not necessarily fall neatly into the definition as notified. Riprap in this context is mainly used for erosion protection where the highway and its infrastructure are located in environments adjacent to crossing rivers, coastal areas, or where there is lands instability. The use of riprap can be as simple as placing large boulders along the highway road reserve to protect from coastal erosion, e.g. Pataki Beach north of Dunedin or north of Palmerston. I think Peter raises that in his evidence in the discussion. Or similarly along riverbanks upstream of bridges to protect abutments from being eroded, and also the use of smaller rock simply being end-tipped on the tie for smaller instability. This can be seen actually if you drive north, just at the end of the northern motorway where there's rock being tipped on a small slump that's come out of the cut better. Riprap can be used as erosion protection around the downstream end of culverts, providing for stormwater through and under the highways. So it's commonly used material and could potentially fall outside the definition. I think the addition of riprap would take some of the uncertainty out of the definition, especially when it's not used in a way such as Gabion baskets, which are probably a common thing that you see it as, or other structures, and where it's talked about where the boulders are placed, they're not actually fixed onto land. Also, not adding riprap to this definition may add unnecessary complexity to the consent processes and justifying the use of the material outside the definition. So that's my first point. So moving on to my second point, which is around policy 3, hazard NH-P3. Waka Kotahi actually further submitted in support of Transpower, and I note in my evidence I didn't include Aurora, but it was a further submission on Transpower and Aurora's submissions to P3 to exclude nationally significant infrastructure from this policy. I disagree with the 42A report, particularly for new activities for state highways that they're unlikely to occur in areas of natural hazard. That is because highways are linear in nature and need to connect with each other. And so where existing highways are located in areas of natural hazard, new highway infrastructure may also be required to be in proximity to those areas. I therefore consider it will be difficult to completely avoid significant and will be completely successful in managing tolerable and maintaining acceptable risk as required by P3 in these areas for highways. For example, Mr. Robinson's evidence he raises the Pataki Beach example, which is the good one in terms of the state highway being affected by coastal erosion. The alternative there is if the highway closes in this location, there is a 280-kilometre detour for highway traffic. This is an example where Waka Kotahi are trying to manage risk, but given climate change in the coastal environment, it may be a location where with time it may be more difficult to achieve the outcomes of P3, but where Waka Kotahi will look at maintaining a highway if at all possible. Another example where it is difficult for state highways to avoid natural hazard is flooding. And for example, between State Highway 1 and Oamaru, there's about 6 rivers. If you look at the Otago Regional Council Hazard database, there's about 6 rivers that are potentially could flood and cut the highway. And look, I understand all of this is kind of dependent on the intensity and duration of rainfalls in terms of risk. But I think the examples that are put for us in terms of Cyclone Gabrielle, there is the unexpectedness of natural hazards and what climate change is doing here. And so to actually, the whole risk assessment side of things is getting quite difficult to manage. So to try and manage something within tolerable limits, it's going to be very difficult to defend that you're actually compliant with that particular policy. So another example is land instability, like when you go north of Dunedin, you cross the Kilmont. The highway traverses a number of landslides. It also just up from Warrington actually runs the length of a landslide. Again, there's areas, just not the Kilmont, but other places where the highway's in place because in hilly steep terrain, there's cut slopes, there's rock slopes, there's rock falls, there's unexpected geotechnical events because of those cut slopes. And it's not to say that Waka Kotahi doesn't design and try and maintain their infrastructure to help mitigate those risks, because that's engineering and that's what should happen in those cases. But just as I said, as illustrated by unexpected geotechnical events in the cyclone, it's getting more difficult. So highways occur in those natural hazard areas as well as other areas. They occur along in a network which is going to be difficult to relocate if they're actually excluded from those areas, or it's made difficult to achieve a consenting pathway. So in my opinion, exclusion of highways or nationally significant infrastructure, I don't know if these are now really fast, does not give Waka Kotahi a get out of jail card free. It just means the consenting pathway and notice of requirement applications do not have an added complexity, and or the consenting pathway remains available for infrastructure in these areas where there may not be many other choices for relocation. So that's my comments on P3. So the next policy is policy 6. Waka Kotahi submitted in support of the DCC submission point how this provision will sit alongside the infrastructure provisions. I also agreed with the DCC and my evidence, but I actually now understand, having come to grips with their plan a little bit further, so I'd like to change my evidence, that I understand that this chapter needs to be read in conjunction with the infrastructure. So that's a change. However, I do actually still have concerns, as mentioned in my evidence, around the word protected. I understand protect means to prevent something being named, something being harmed or damaged. I consider this a high threshold against works and maintenance. I consider this a high threshold against works and maintenance will be required to be assessed. To be clear, it is not Waka Kotahi's intent to adversely affect systems, natural or otherwise. However, I think it's important to give some examples where this policy could be difficult to meet. And when I was talking to Peter about this, I said, well, look, Waka Kotahi submitted on this, I'm preparing evidence, give me some examples of where this might actually be a problem. And for him, one of the more obvious is drainage, and it's about the natural catchments that are actually below the state highways. These catchments may in place not have the capacity to cope with the addition of stormwater from the highway, and that they need to be modified. This modification in turn may cause changes to that catchment, and whether that's, and there's a conversation and maybe a consenting issue on to make sure that those catchments actually don't, with the addition of stormwater, don't actually harm land further downstream of that. But it is an issue, obviously, if you're putting a big linear structure, you've got to have culverts so the water comes through. Those culverts may direct water where they haven't done before if the highway wasn't there, for example. So you end up with issues with erosion and so on if you don't manage it properly. Another example he gave me, albeit it's from Southland because that's where he did his network management work, it was of the Whitestone Bridge, which is close to Te Anau. And in that bridge there are a number of made groins, and they're to actually protect that bridge, or I think it's the northern abutment, sure on that, one of the abutments, and from erosion. And the risk there is, it's a pretty grunty river. It may flood, it may take out that bridge. And if that bridge is taken out, those protection measures would have to be destroyed in order to either get a temporary bridge or to construct a new bridge. So you've got the example of where protection structures have been put in, and to actually get at and maintain or replace the structure that they're trying to protect, they may need to be taken away. So it just becomes whether that's an issue. So like my discussion for P3, P6 in its current form may add difficulty to maintaining highways and add unnecessary complexity to consenting in some locations. Hence, I would request that nationally significant infrastructure like highways are exempt from this policy. And that's basically me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Good to see you again. It's been a wee while.
Yes.
Yeah. Your evidence is very clear, and it raises issues that have been raised in relation to a whole range of management and resources issues across the board. The staff, Andrew, yesterday suggested and I'm talking here in relation to P3, if you work through a PP6, that's I don't like this new planning terminology with all these letters and numbers and stuff. But if you operate in a significant natural area or a biodiversity area or something, there's a carve out that you can go through a process to get a consent because of your functional needs. This is slightly different, but what Andrew was suggesting, if you work through particularly that consequence table, what you probably find is that because of the nature of your activity and the way you design it, you may not actually trigger the risk table concern where you might be prohibited from going into an area. So you gave a range of examples. And I don't know, have you actually dropped them in to say that consequence table just to work out exactly where they sit? Is it moderate, is out of service for up to a week? And I'm thinking there may be the coastal road, for example, and Nevis Bluff, and how do they fit into that?
So Nevis Bluff is one of the areas that Whakaputahi has its eyes firmly on, and it has a regular maintenance, and they get up there and they try not to close the highway except if they're blasting big rocks. You know, you stop, you might be stopped for 10 or 20 minutes, but you know, they sort of allow platoons through as it allows. And this is where I struggle with. Well, there's two things here. Whakaputahi didn't submit an appendix, so I struggled in terms of my submission, what I could actually say and what I could actually do with that. But I did look at it when I was actually preparing it, and I struggled with it. Where do highways fit? Are they lifelines? They're certainly important to lifelines and connectivity.
That's kind of where I'm looking at, but you also got social and cultural significance.
So all of those things.
Are they buildings?
No, I mean, you might say some of the things that they construct are structures, but that's not a building necessarily.
If we had the Milford Road in Otago, which, and these guys will laugh because it did used to be a part of Otago way back in the day, and you wouldn't be able to build that.
No, you wouldn't have been.
You wouldn't be able to get into some spectacular countries if you had to go through that. It's kind of what you're saying, right? If we need to get somewhere through dodgy land.
And I think, again, I'm not a risk assessment person, so obviously
I'm not either having to go through
that. So I don't envy the people that have had to come up with those tables and things because you need something. But when you start actually looking at the day-to-day stuff of highways and probably other big infrastructure providers and so on, it becomes very difficult because Milford, for example, they close the road when the risk is significant and intolerable and all of those words because, you know, they've got to bring down avalanches. You know, they'll go and fly and they'll drop explosives and they try and get the avalanches. If they're too big and if they still hang up there, they close the road. There's just no two ways about it.
Yeah.
And it's similarly because when I was thinking about flooding, even with flooding, you know, it's a type of risk management that when it gets to a point, the highway closes. So I could see an argument that you're actually managing that significant risk because you're saying we're not going to allow you to continue to use the highway because it's too deep and you can see cars floating away. But it's the unexpected stuff. It's like that big landslide that came down on the west coast side of Makarora and carried away those two. There were two tourists that were swept away and only one body was ever found and so on. You can't, as much as you want to manage those things and as much as Whakaputahi want to manage those things by doing the Nevis Bluff and so on, it's the unexpected events that come at them because it's such a big network. And things that might have never been a problem for 100 more years suddenly do become a problem because of either intense rainfall or whatever's happening in the slopes. So yeah, it's just if you're going to have a network and you want to keep places connected, then we're stuck with the highway. And the highway's, in theory, has got to go past Kaipiki, it's got to go under the Nevis, it's got to, all of those things. And you actually managed it to your best ability. So what's significant and what's minor and what the consequences is, I don't know, you guys might be able to tell me more so, but I just found it quite difficult to place it.
So if we accepted your submission and provided that exemption for, and it'll probably extend to regionally significant, given some of the other submissions, but I haven't considered in my own head where you fall in the policy, because you have to still go through a process.
Yeah.
It's more just that avoidance you're concerned about.
Yeah, if you suddenly say that you can't, you've got to manage that risk to a tolerable level, those examples that I've given, I can just see it gets very difficult very quickly. And obviously the first outcome, which is, I can't remember what it is, when natural hazard is significant, the activity is avoided.
Yeah.
Highways can't necessarily avoid it. They can continue to manage, and but there are times when there is a significant risk on parts of the network.
Yeah, there has been discussions around that phrase. It's why is the activity avoided, and it's really mitigating the significance of the risk. So by your design, so you're avoiding significant risk through your design. It may not also achieve tolerable in your circumstances, as you're saying. But
No, I mean, you can throw the best geotechnical engineers and the road designers and all that, but you still, just as I said, you still can run into an issue somewhere on the highway.
yeah, we live in a pretty dynamic part of the world.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay, well, that's all I wanted to traverse with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just following on from Commissioner Cubitt's question, because as he indicated, we have had other submissions around P3 as well. And I think Transpower, for example, they just requested an exclusion to that first limb. So from what you're saying, I'm just trying to clarify, you would be happy with that type of approach at all, if that's that first avoidance is your key concern?
Well, no, it's actually, because I think in my evidence I suggested in the introductory paragraph to those outcomes there, because when the natural hit risk is tolerable, manage the level of risk that it does not exceed tolerable. And that's
So
a problem.
A concern as well.
That's a problem as well. And when the natural risk is acceptable, maintain the level of risk, or means a natural hazard to an activity acceptable. So that's why I tried to hit that top paragraph and say, if you exclude us there, then you're not.
Yeah.
But I was also careful to say, because I don't think I've been clever enough to come up with the exact answer for this, or something similar, I think I said in my evidence. So if there's some other submitter or relief sought that achieves the same thing, then obviously that would be.
So if we were to accept what you're suggesting, along similar lines, there would be no, excuse me, no requirement for new activities from Waka Kotahi to manage natural hazard risk under the RPS.
I think that you need to be clear that you're still going to be subject, or Waka Kotahi is still going to be subject to resource consents, notice of requirement assessments, and however what the new legislation, either its outcomes or effects or whatever comes into place, you've still got to jump through those hoops. I don't think it's like I tried to say, I don't think it's a get out of it. What I'm trying to say is that you've got to keep that consenting pathway clear, so that you can tolerate state highways in those areas.
Yeah, I suppose the flip side of it is if there's no natural hazard policies that applied to, for example, Waka Kotahi in the RPS, that doesn't really give the district councils any sort of guidance around what would be in rules, if anything. I mean, you might find that you wouldn't have to consider those matters.
I think Laura, so what did Laura do in their submission?
I suppose I'm just sort of struggling a little bit with the suggestion that there should be no policies that would apply to new activities for nationally significant infrastructure.
So no natural hazard.
No natural hazard policy.
Is that going to be, well, yeah, and that's a question that's for debate. Is that going to be, is that going to be a problem given that they're going to be caught by basically every other provision when locating new infrastructure, and it becomes potentially an adverse environmental effect if they don't manage that properly? And then as I think the 42A report writer, they've got their own business case process that sits outside of the RMA and the RPS process as well. Okay, no, thank you. Yeah, just if you don't, just follow on from what I played around with, in my mind at least, what a rule was said for P3, and they had for the first outcome of the one, when the natural hazard is significant, the activity is avoided unless the activity is nationally significant infrastructure that has a functional need or operational need for its location and the risk is appropriately managed. So that whole functional need or operational need for its location and risk where it's appropriately managed. The reason I didn't drag that through to my evidence was because it was in that first one, and I felt that all three of them were there. But I thought that the fact that they were restricting it to the functional need or operational need was quite good. Thanks.
Yeah, I suppose I was toying around with the wording and for subclause 1 of P3 and suggesting to you that we had a wording, considered a wording like where practicable, avoid natural hazard risk levels which are significant. So it's the risk levels rather than the activity that are addressed, rather than leaving a vacuum for infrastructure.
I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that's good, but again, it doesn't address the 2 and 3 where what is acceptable and can you actually continue to manage something that's been tolerable when you're subject to weather events.
Right. Yeah, thank you for those examples that you gave on P6, because I noticed that in my copy of your evidence when I wrote it, I've written give some practical examples of concerns. So, you were spot on with what you came along with. So thank you for that.
It's no problem. Yeah, I thought my evidence was a bit deficient.
And the only other thing that I want to ask about was just in terms, just help me out in terms of hard protection structures and the arguments about definitions. Where do they come? Where are they referred to in these policies or methods?
They're hard.
Chapter?
Oh, well, actually, you got me on that. I haven't written it down. I know that it's dealt with in the hazards, but I assume that it's in the interpretation.
P7, I'm told.
Yeah.
Okay, right, thank you very much.
Thank you. I did actually have some copies of my comments of.
Well, you could end those.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit late in the case, but. Thank you.
Thank you. So Kate, next one is off-road adventures.
I haven't been able to get hold of them.
Right,
I've tried calling Ben and his phone is turned off,
I see,
and I got his bounce back from the email again.
right. Okay.
So, he should be here about 10.
So Jean-Luc,
I can try to get Jean-Luc.
So Luke should be on his way. I've
Oh,
emailed.
you've already
I've emailed him this morning. He said he'll be here about 10.
stepped straight up. Oh, okay.
we'll have a quick cup of tea. So Luke, you just come.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to my submission. I am the manager of the natural hazards team of the Regional Council. So I just want to make 3 points on my submission. The first one is we submitted mainly on the APP6, the Appendix 6 of the proposed RPS on the risk table. We subsequently had a discussion with Mr. McLennan on that table and the APP6 approach. And Mr. McLennan has considered our submission, and in his opening statement, he's proposing to change slightly the way the risk is represented in the in table 8 by adding some hatching areas to trigger the need for a quantitative assessment of risk. So I think this, in my opinion, goes into resolving our concern. I think that a compromise between the theory and operationality of that table. And the other point I wanted to make is we've been using the proposed RPS risk approach in different program of work at the Regional Council. We support the approach. The big advantage of that is to really give some practical baseline we can use when we do risk assessment compared to situation where we just have a very theoretical approach to risk, but actually don't have a baseline we can start with. And we've been using that in a situation up in north of Queenstown. I don't know if you're familiar with Idle Lake, Wakatipu, Glenorchy, that area there. We've got an adaptation, a natural hazard adaptation work program where we're trying to understand first the hazards, the risk, and what can we do about them in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So we've been using the framework in that context. And the other example where we've been using the principle of the proposed RPS is a region-wide risk assessment, natural hazard risk assessment. And the purpose of that risk assessment is really to build a picture of the level of risk in the region when we consider natural hazards. And like I said before, the proposed methods is really a baseline for that work. So I'm happy to have a question. I think I understand you've got a few for me. So feel free to ask, and I'll do my best to respond.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jean-Luc. You're probably lucky that we don't have too many questions because sort of getting to the end of it and starting to understand how it works. You probably didn't hear Jerry Min was here in relation to what the Katahi infrastructure and the issues that they see around applying the tables, which I've lost. I can just find. So, given your experience in this field, well, first and foremost, I'm just using them as an example to see how it might work. The table 7 consequence table. Where would, for example, a state highway fit within that built environment? I sort of see them as a lifeline, I guess. They probably fall under that. Yeah, so they fall under the lifelines assessment. I think what she was saying is that there's going to be areas where we have no options but to put state highway there. They aren't going to fit within that tolerable level. So they might be likely or possible in the effects, or almost certain that they could be major or catastrophic effects if something big goes off and they simply can't avoid that. So how do you currently deal with a scenario like that? Because the way the policy's set up is that activity would simply have to be avoided in that area. And even though it's not in the target, we talked about the Milford Road as an example of that. You simply wouldn't be able to build that now. So have you got any examples that you've dealt with recently that might fit in that sort of category, but sort of get caught out working through that process?
No recent example on that. I wonder if the mitigation or engineering work could reduce the risk to a level where move from the significant to tolerable by mitigating that, knowing that it is a key infrastructure, for example.
Yeah, no, and Andrew suggested that yesterday that when you do think about some of their examples, there's no amount of design or issues going to deal with what might come down off the mountains onto a road or something like that. Yeah. The other thing was in relation to the risk table, the hatched areas that are proposed with the quantitative assessment required. I know you've done a lot of work in this area. So for individual sort of resource consent applications and that, what sort of implications are there for a subdivision or some sort of other infrastructure cost-wise to go through that process?
I think my understanding is that this approach applies to more like a community scale or a wider scale than a resource consent.
Yeah, I think initially it could apply to resource consents until that regional wide thing, and that's caused a bit of alarm because of probably that cost factor, and what's involved here is quite significant compared to what we're used to, I guess, in that resource consent phase.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, cost is a factor in those assessment, but for me, in my view, if someone wants to develop in an area that's been highlighted as with major or catastrophic consequences, that justify the cost of better understanding the risk and proposing either a way to deal or mitigate that risk.
Yeah.
So it's really the level of risk justify the cost.
Yeah, it's just where in the risk table that so it's likely possible, okay, the effects might be, consequences may be major, but it's considered a tolerable effect. I'm not sure what that means and what the cost would be involved in that. When the original table say, well, that's tolerable, so that's okay. And that's proposed is we're taking another step.
That's the risk, and one of the reasons of our submission initially was that the table, as it was before, could be misread in terms of if it's yellow, it's okay. But what the table is saying actually is if it's yellow in some situation, you should go another step to better understand the risk.
Yeah.
And that's why we think the hatching is kind of indicating this, that although it's tolerable, it's in that area of the metrics as a cusp, justifying a further analysis of the risk level.
Yeah, you're right, because I looked at that table and went on to consent here and said, well, that's tolerable, what are you on about? I don't need to go any further, but yeah. Okay, well, that's all I had for you. Thanks very much, Jean-Luc.
One of the one of the submissions that we've received is that there should be some time limit in terms of the region-wide assessment process under AP6. How massive a task is that for all risks as compared with, say, trying to identify significant risks? And in terms of the region-wide risk assessment process that you're undertaking at the moment using this process, is that focusing on just significant risk or all risk?
That's the way we are progressing this work for the moment is an initial screening where we will consider all the areas, all the region, all the hazards, and apply a simplified risk approach where we'll be able to identify the acceptable, tolerable, and significant risk. And based on that screening work, we'll select either, we haven't decided yet if we take the significant and the tolerable together, or if we focus on the significant only into a more detailed risk assessment. And we know that any risk assessment is going to be iterative, especially because you on a wide scale, because you start with a limited level of information and you gather more information while you're doing the risk assessment. So the idea is really to have an initial screening, a more detailed risk assessment, and probably in some areas we have to go back and do another risk assessment after we collected new information that was highlighted as a gap during that initial phase. But it's always a challenge to progress things with, trying to decide what the right level of information we need to progress things. And I think what's proposed in the RPS can be used at with different level of information and trying to progress even though we don't have everything fully analyzed.
If we were to accede to that request, is a 5-year period workable and practicable for identifying particularly significant risk?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. We've already done good progress on trying to think about the methodology and how to apply that at a regional scale.
Thank you. That was the main issue that I wanted to cover with you. I just was also interested, though, to have a view from you, and I'm intrigued as to your own personal situation in terms of qualifications and experience to do this type of work. How broadly available throughout the country, or in Otago in particular, are consultants who might be able to apply Appendix 6, and where did your own personal experience in that regard come from?
My personal experience is really focused on flood hazard. That's my
Sorry, is
focused on flood hazard.
right.
That's my studies, my background. But I've been in the manager role for about 6 years, and I've been exposed to a wider range of hazard that the region is exposed to. We've got internally a team that is applying the methods, and now at a wider New Zealand context, there are several consultants that can do that type of work, and we've worked with some of them in the past. And I think some of the direction from central government around risk assessment, especially climate change risk assessments, for example, are also triggering more interest by consultants, and hopefully they'll be also increasing their resources in that field, in the risk assessment field. But from my experience, until now, we didn't have a skill issue to do risk assessments for Otago at least.
Right. Thank you for that, and thank you for your time and effort. And sorry, there was one final point, and that is that QLDC are still seeking in relation to, I don't know whether you've got before you table 8, I think it is, coloured one, risk table, yes. They're still seeking that there be a hatching on the unlikely and rare in the major category to require quantitative assessment. And am I being too rough and ready in this description of it, that you've got a potential cost factor, which we're told could be up to 50,000 to provide this sort of assessment. If you're looking at resource consent applicants and the fairness or reasonableness of that, and weighing that against risks that we accept the recommendation of the board writer is once every 1,000 to 2,500 years for unlikely, and for rare over 2,500. It just seems to me that even if we've got a major risk of recommended potential death level of maximum of 10 for major, you just wonder whether it's necessary
To have hatching.
to have hatching on those two.
Yeah. I mean, I think from experience, when you look to risk in theory, I would support hatching. Now in practice, we've looked to at very high level, using the table to basically try to map where all the hazards and consequences sit for Otago. And basically what we've noticed is most of them, we sit into that kind of moderate to possible part of the table.
Right.
It's only some of the ground shaking earthquake related hazard that could sit into that really catastrophic and largely rare consequence. So yes, I think ideally we want hatching on those major for a more quantitative risk, but in practice, I think you will not need them because actually the hazard that trigger the quantitative risk would be in the more likely area of the table.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your input today.
Thank you.
So that concludes us. Thank you. See you next week. We'll see you, Mr. Anderson.
He's probably here on Monday.
Good. Thank
Be
you.
here on Tuesday.
I'm not planning to be here on Tuesday.
You're avoiding that one.